I think that most of us have noticed that there is a new gladiator standing next to the flagpole. And this new gladiator appeared one day, and he's a little gladiator. And I had a student who noticed him and said, "Miss Dolan, where did he come from?" And I said, "I don't know." And then he said, "Is he a ghost?" And I said, "Yes." Then I decided I want to know where he came from. So on a beautiful day, a day when there was a full moon, because this is a fairy tale, and in fairy tales, there's magic. And in fairy tales, there's magic when there's a full moon. I sat on the bench outside and I said, "Little gladiator, would you share your story with me?" And he did. I'm going to tell you today the first part of his story. There are some scary parts I want you to know. So if it gets too scary, just turn off your video. When he first opened his eyes, it was in the middle of a dark, deep forest. It was very dark. He opened his eyes and it was silent. The last thing he remembered was being in a battle. He heard screams and running and the sound of horses, but now it was dark and it was silent. And the next thing he knew, his head was hurting. He put his hand up to his forehead and his hand was wet because he was wounded and he was bleeding. He began to panic because he knew he was in trouble. He looked around and there was a huge tree in front of him with a large patch of moss. One thing he remembered, that moss on the wound would stop the bleeding. So he went over to the tree, stumbled over to the tree and pulled a piece of moss off of the tree and held it to his head. It instantly started to feel better, but all of a sudden, the ground under him began to shake and the branches in the tree began to wave wildly, but there was no wind. And he was frightened. And then he heard a voice. And the voice was coming from the tree. And the voice said, "Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are pulling the moss off of my bark? That's my moss." And the branch came up and was about to crash down on the little gladiator's head when suddenly a shadow, a huge shadow, came across the gladiator. And all of a sudden, in front of him, in between him and the tree, was a giant, great horned owl, the largest of all the owls, with piercing yellow eyes, huge, piercing yellow eyes, and talons the size of hands. And his wings were as wide as the gladiator was tall. And the owl spoke. And the owl said, "Stop," to the tree. And the tree obeyed him. He said, "Who do you think you are?" And the tree said, "Ah, he took my moss." And the owl said, "Who do you think you are?" The owl turned to the little gladiator and he said, "Who are you? And you know how owls talk. They always talk like that. Who do you think you are? And the little gladiator, who had never seen a talking tree and had never seen a talking owl, said, I'm a gladiator, Cerularianus Spartacus. And the owl said, well, that's a very long name. Gladiator Cerularianus Spartacus. I'm just going to call you GCS. And the little gladiator said, okay, because he was scared to death. He never saw anything like this happen to him in his whole life. So the owl explained to him that he had been wounded and had fallen asleep in the forest, but that all was well and he could relax now and he would watch over him. When suddenly there was a sound, a whistling, hissing sound. And right in between the owl, the gladiator, was a flaming arrow that stuck right into the tree. A flaming arrow that must have been from a battle. The tree shrieked, oh no, I've been wounded and I'll catch on fire. Help me, help me. The little gladiator jumped to his feet. He grabbed his belt. He threw it around the arrow and he began to pull with all his might. He pulled and the tree said, pull, please. And the owl said, pull, please. And pop, the arrow popped out of the tree. But there were dry leaves on the ground. And the little gladiator began stomping on the fire to put it out because the dry leaves would have caught fire and everything would have burned. And the little gladiator put the fire out. And the tree said, oh, you've saved me. You've saved my life. And the owl said, well, isn't that an interesting turn? A minute ago, you were going to clobber him, and now he has saved your life. And the tree said, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I am so sorry. I didn't know who you were. And I acted like that. I am so sorry. All of a sudden, the little gladiator began to hear the sounds of battle. It had been so quiet, but now he heard the horse hooves and he heard shouting. And he said, wait, I think that's the other warriors. I think that's who I was with. And he started to run towards the sounds of the battle. And the owl said, no, don't go, don't go. You have no weapons. Don't go, don't go. And the tree, who had a new friend, said, don't go, little gladiator. But the little gladiator ran towards the battle. The owl flew as high as he could so he could look down on top of the scene. The little gladiator got to the edge of the forest and he saw the battle. He saw the great warrior that he had been following in the middle of the battle, and he saw him fall to the ground wounded. And the little gladiator said to himself, I have to help him. I have to do something. He had no helmet. He had no knife. He had no sword. He had no shield. But there was a jar of water. He picked it up. He said, I will run into the battle and give the great warrior a drink. That will help him. So he ran straight through the battle to the great warrior. He knelt down beside him and he gave him a drink. And the warrior said, who are you? You are so brave. You have no weapons and you're in the middle of the battle to help me. And the little gladiator said, I'm gladiator Cerularianus Spartacus. but my friends call me GCS. And the great warrior said, and I will call you hero, because you have helped another hero. And back at the tree, you showed exceptional effort when you pulled the arrow out of the tree. And the little gladiator thought, wait a minute, he wasn't there. How did he know I pulled the arrow out of the tree? But you know, magic happens in fairy tales, not like real life, but in fairy tales, magic can happen. But just at that moment, the little gladiator began to feel a little bit faint. He had been wounded, he ran into battle, and the next thing you know, he drops down to his knees, and the great warrior says, "Are you okay?" He said, "I don't think so. I think I might faint." And the great warrior said, "I will give you my helmet, my knife, and my sword because you are so brave." And that's the last thing the little gladiator remembered because he fainted. The battle was raging all around. There were flaming arrows, there were horses, and there were battles. He was in great danger. The next thing that happened, the owl landed next to him and pulled the cloak of the great warrior over top of the little gladiator. And it was the cloak of invisibility. Instantly, he was invisible and he was safe. And everything went black and he was asleep. Several hours later, he opened his eyes and listened, and it was silent. He pulled the cloak off, and everything was gone. There was no warrior, no horses, no wagons, no fires, no flaming arrows, but there was a helmet, a knife, and a sword from the great warrior. And the owl was sitting there looking at him. And the little gladiator said, "Where is everybody?" And the owl said, "Oh, you've been sleeping for a long time. But the great warrior left you his helmet, his knife, and his sword." And the little gladiator said, "But they're huge. I can't wear them." The owl said, "Try it on." So he picked up the helmet, which was so big he could barely lift it, and he put it on his head, and instantly it was the right size. And he picked up the knife, which was so heavy it took 2 hands to pick it up, and instantly it was the right size. He put it right into his belt. And he picked up the sword, which he could only pick up the end. He couldn't even lift it. And instantly, it was the right size. More magic in the fairy tale. He said to the owl, "I think I'm ready to go." And the owl said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I have a quest." He said, "A quest? That's a very big word for a very little gladiator." He said, "My quest is to find my friend. I haven't seen him for 10 years. 10 years, said the owl. "And who is this friend?" He said, "He's a knight. He's very tall. He has a full suit of armor. He's much taller than I am. He's very brave. His name is Sir Gliss, and I'm trying to find him because I haven't seen him in 10 years. And the owl said, "Well, I like a good quest. Let's go. I'll go with you." Because in fairy tales, there's always a guide to help the hero find where he's going. So that's all we're going to hear today. The next time, we'll learn more about the little gladiator's quest, what happens with the guide, and does he ever find Sir Gliss, his friend who is the tall knight. So that's the end of our story for today. I do love stories because fairy tales and stories with grand adventures do inspire us to do great things. Albert Einstein, who we saw as one of the pumpkins, said, "Someday, when you grow up, you'll be old enough to read fairy tales again," because we learn a lot about truth in fairy tales.